Chapter 23. The Table of Rulers and Ringmasters. Andrew wrapped his arms around the happy girl and began to laugh joyfully. My, these hugs of yours, where did these come from? Virginia's joyful laughter turned into tears of joy. Uncle Andrew, you will not believe everything that has happened. He pulled his niece's head back and wiped her tears with his sleeve. I cannot even begin to imagine all of the excitement you have been through these past couple of weeks, but I believe I do know what is happening. Hope fired up in Virginia's eyes as if she was back in the library with Daniel. You know what's going on? Andrew smiled and finished wiping her cheeks dry. I believe I do, honey. Virginia dabbed her sleeve in the corners of her eyes. Good, because everyone here is calling me by a different name and saying that I'm some special person prophesied to return to them. See, exclaimed Two Moons, even she does not know that she is Cohen. An identity is something understood and received one bit at a time, day by day, Two Moons, said Charles. But a title is something either received or denied, rebutted Two Moons. She does not even know who she is. Who you say she is. She hasn't even taken the wine of El-Yamin for all we know. If she's not even found in his covenant, how can we depend upon her to stay and help unite us? Why should we listen to her? Charles rose to his feet. You senseless, heartless, arrogant. Charles was silenced by a hand on his shoulder. He looked behind him and saw Daniel, looking at him sharply. At that moment, Charles slowly sat in his chair, remembering the words of his elder. He looked at Two Moons and placed his hand over his heart, signaling his apologies. Two Moons gave a slight nod of his head and sat back down. Gentlemen, said Andrew, looking at them, are we going to be all right for this gathering? Both Charles and Two Moons nodded their heads. Daniel and Andrew looked at each other from across the table. This is it, old friend, said Daniel solemnly. This is what we've been waiting for. Andrew nodded his head in agreement. I believe it is. What does that mean? Asked Virginia. What is it? Andrew unwound Virginia's arms from around him and held her fingers in his strong hands. Virginia, my dear, a lot of what you are about to hear may very well sound absolutely nothing short of crazy. But, honey, during this meeting, I am asking you to do one extreme act of courage and to trust me for a little bit longer in this wild and crazy ride. Can you do that, Virginia? At the very least, until this meeting is over. Virginia looked doubtfully into her uncle's eyes, but his presence brought a stronger hope that kept her on her feet. What are you going to tell them? Something that will challenge your faith, rock your world, and expose a lost, forgotten mystery. The truth. Virginia looked with curious wonder at the man in front of her. Uncle Andrew, who am I? Please tell me. All will be explained in a moment's time, but for now, Virginia, I need an answer. Do you trust me? Virginia took a deep breath, held back her fear, and nodded. Yes. Andrew led her back to her seat. All right, then. I will need you to sit right here for now. He pulled back the chair as she sat down, while I go down there with Daniel. You're not going to be down here with me? Virginia questioned with concern. No, not for this meeting. I will have to sit down there with the rest of the elders. But once the meeting is over, then we can walk and talk together. Virginia took another deep breath, this time breathing out doubt, while hope fell upon her. Okay. Andrew smiled and placed his finger up underneath her chin. You have no idea just how important you are. Everything will be okay, honey. Virginia smiled at her uncle. Thank you, Uncle Andrew. Andrew returned her smile with a smile, and then walked down to the far end of the table. Virginia's heart ached inside of her. She so badly wanted to sit next to her uncle, the only kin she had in this land. However, she remained in her seat and fought the urge to follow him. She watched as he and Daniel sat beside each other with a few other elders at the far end of the table. There were 5 of them, including her uncle. She took a moment to study more carefully the other dignitaries seated in random spots throughout the length of the table. Some looked like warriors from medieval times, others from the Middle East, some from African kingdoms, and a few Indians like Charles and Two Moons. One of the Indians seated in the middle of the table had a dove resting on his shoulder, like Tristan's. Virginia's eyes caught one of the elders rising from his seat. With a gavel in his hand, he hit the wooden table. Everyone stood up from their seats and faced Virginia. Stand up, whispered Charles. What's going on? She whispered back as she rose to her feet. Face that way, said Charles, pointing his finger somewhere between north and east. Virginia turned around. Like this? Perfect. Now cover your eyes with your hand and bow your head slightly. She cupped her hand over her eyes and bowed her head. Like this? You're doing great. Okay, why are we doing this? Right then, every man in the room began to sing a song that echoed loudly in the chambers. It was in a language she did not know, although it sounded almost like a Semitic dialect. Their pitch was low and their deep voices sang in unison, sounding like a band of pirates singing upon a ship. Hoping to see Charles or even Two Moons, Virginia stood there looking out of the corners of her eyes here and there. Am I supposed to sing this with them? Am I doing it right? After about a minute or two, the voices softened and every man took his seat. You can sit now, whispered Charles. She took her seat. What was that? It is a prayer by the waters of Oralmuti. They are his words, and they stand as a reminder of our allegiance to the throne of El Yamin. Why do we face that way when we sing it? Because we face where his throne will be. But I thought his throne was here somewhere. This city submits to his rule, but his throne will be in Ir Aria. Where? Also known as the City of the Lion. Okay, a lot of new questions just came to my mind. Charles smiled, and I have no doubt that those shall be answered as well. Fellow lords and rulers, shouted Daniel, his voice resonating in a loud echo in the large stone room. You have been summoned here to answer the call of what is possibly the most pressing news that we have heard in a very, very long time. Soaring Eagle, please rise. Virginia watched as Charles stood to his feet. What's happening? Soaring Eagle, continued the elder, report has come that the powers of the Kingdom of Darkness, from Skalgal Mudarets, have begun to stir even greater in the southern woods of Earth Stars. Can you attest to this? Yes, echoed Charles's voice in the room. Please, give the report for what you and your people have seen. Charles gave a brief, blushing smile at Virginia and then spoke loudly. Fellow warriors, as you all know, my people have done everything within their power to help protect the tribes of the southern woods of Earth Stars. We have spilled our blood and lost many of our kin in an attempt to keep the tribes that are secluded within the borders safe. But recently, one of our greatest threats has become more rampant. The forest phantoms are now hunting on Earth. There was a long pause. Shock and confusion echoed in the room as the men at the table began to murmur to one another in hushed tones. Where did they go? Asked one of the dignitaries. Mason County is where I live on Earth, continued Charles. There is a gate hidden deep within the mountains of Mason County that links with the gate within the borders of the southern woods of Earth Stars. You all have known this as it was discovered around 30 years ago. It was at Mason County where I saw them. What was the purpose of their mission? Asked an Indian at the table. Their intentions were uncertain at first, said Charles, but their plans became more obvious with time. They hunted for Cohen. Two Moons rose from his seat. And why would you lay claim to this first? Virginia looked at Charles, expecting him to rise in defense against Two Moons, but the warrior held back his savagery. The first time they were spotted in Mason County was at the house of Cohen, said Charles. They came when they thought she was alone. There was only one, a scout. They continued to remain in the shadows studying her, making sure that she was, in fact, the one they were after. Once they were convinced, they made their attack. Two Moons crossed his arm and raised his chin. And this is all you have, a group of forest phantoms wanting to hunt someone down. He pointed a finger at Virginia. This is your proof that she is Cohen? Charles turned his body, completely facing Two Moons. They chose to come through the gate into a world they abhor in search of a woman they wanted dead, attacked in broad daylight in a public setting, and continued to hunt us down practically all the way here. I highly doubt they would risk all that time and effort for mere prey. Forest phantoms alone are nothing but wild, large, demonic wolves. They hunt and chase whatever they want. Why should we care what they're after on Earth? For many reasons, we should be concerned. For one, they are strategic. Second of all, they were not alone. Charles turned his attention back to the men about the table. They were led by Princess Aniatha. The room became silent once again. This time, not one of the men at the table talked back and forth with one another. Even Two Moons refused to speak, his attention caught, his gaze focused and waiting for Charles to continue. And even she is not alone, said Charles. Dark Cry of the tribe of Bloodstar leads the pack of phantoms that hunt us. I believe he was the scout that came the first night and also led Aniatha to Mason High School, where we were ambushed. Together, Aniatha and Darkcry have attempted to kill us more than once. Charles pointed his finger at Virginia. To get one in our group whom they call Cohen. The Dark Ones even call her Cohen? Asked Two Moons. Yes, said Charles. Two Moons sat back in his seat, his face still focused, yet not all the way persuaded. "Thank you, Soaring Eagle," said the elder at the end of the table. "You may be seated." Charles sat down. Virginia saw Daniel looking down at the table, as if staring through her. "I would like to call our dear elder Andrew to share what he has witnessed in this season of events," he said. Even though he was far down the table, Virginia believed she saw her uncle smiling at her as he rose from his seat. "Fellow leaders," he began, "I would like to reflect upon what Soaring Eagle has said and share that, truly, we have not seen the darkness around us moving like this since the days of our forefathers. At first I found it hard to believe until I saw it play out before my eyes. As most of you know, the young lady who sits at the seat of Cohen at the end of this table is my niece, Virginia Singerman. She has been staying with me for the past few days back on Earth. The reason for her stay was the tragic death of her parents, whom the forest phantoms murdered." "Where were they murdered?" asked one of the Indians present. "Miami, Florida," said Andrew. A rising of murmuring whispered loudly in the room amongst the leaders of the table. "The phantoms have hunted as far as Florida?" questioned the same Indian. "Yes, led by Darkrai himself." "Why did they travel so far just to kill a family who was nowhere near the gate and had no knowledge of Alaythia?" Andrew rested his knuckles on the table and took a deep breath. "That's not entirely true." He lowered his head, looking aimlessly down at the table. Virginia's parents were really, really close to discovering Alaythia. There was a wondering pause in the group. No one said a word but only waited for what Andrew would say next. Virginia's attention drew closer and closer to her uncle. "My parents, what?" Andrew raised his head. "About a month before their death, in fact." Andrew looked down, grief shadowing his face. "They were so close to finding Alaythia, just a few steps away, you might say." "A month?" said another Indian at the table. Andrew smiled slightly, expecting this. "Yes." Virginia listened closely as the men began to toss a phrase back and forth to each other, but it was said with such excitement that Virginia could not make it out. She leaned over to Charles. "Charles," she whispered, "what are they saying?" Charles leaned over to her. "New Star." "New Star, what does that mean?" "It comes from an ancient prophecy that was spoken back during the time of Burning Eagle. The prophecy spoke specifically of the return of Cohen to Alaythia to unite the people once again and prepare them for a final battle." "But what does that have to do with what we are talking about?" "The prophecy states that a sign in the heavens will appear in the land of Alaythia to mark the start of Cohen's return. About a month ago, there was a long and cloudy day. It was near dusk, and the sky was completely veiled. As the night began to darken, a bright star appeared in the sky that was so scintillating and beautiful, it broke through the clouds and shined on the land. No one could believe what they had seen, but then the star faded away. When it did, the clouds began to split, revealing the Milky Way sky. It was at that moment that everyone remembered the prophecy. Instantly, tribes and nations sent delegates to the city of Gaal, hoping to better understand what they saw." "And did they get an answer for why that star appeared? Was it truly because of prophecy?" Charles turned his head and looked down the long table. "Why don't you ask them for yourself?" Virginia looked down the table with Charles. Every single dignitary at the table looked at her with curious eyes as if a character had jumped out of a book to greet them. Even Two Moons could not help but stare in amazement. "Dare we say?" questioned one of the Indians. "Has Cohen truly returned to us?" Virginia leaned back into her seat. Her heart raced in her throat. She looked down at her uncle, her worried face begging him to say something. "Please, Uncle Andrew, please tell them who I really am. Tell them before this gets any worse." All eyes followed Virginia's gaze and looked back at Andrew. Andrew took a deep breath, looked at Virginia in her eyes and smiled. "Gentlemen, I dare say Cohen has indeed returned to us." The crowd began to talk once more, adding up the evidence presented before them in the testimonies, signs, and wonders that had taken place in the past few weeks. A few Indians began to shout questions at Charles from the other end of the table in a different language, to which he would reply in the same language. Two Moons looked at Virginia with his piercing eyes. "Can it be possible?" Virginia's heart fell to the ground as the last pillar she trusted was kicked out from underneath her. "Uncle Andrew, what have you said? What have you done? Why? I needed you. I trusted you." "Well," questioned Two Moons in a loud voice, "if she truly is Cohen, then let's allow her to lead our armies into battle." Virginia's heart flew up from the floor, ran through her body, and slammed into her throat. She looked up at Two Moons with paranoid eyes. "Lead your what to where?" She looked at Charles. Seeing the worried look on her face, Charles stood up. 2 moons, he said. You act in haste. Do you not remember the prophecy? It never said that she would lead us into battle, but that she would be the start of uniting the people once again. Virginia's blood pressure went a little down at the sound of that. Okay, I don't have to lead an army. That's good, right? But other prophecies speak of how she would fight with us, declared 2 moons. Am I right? Charles paused for a second, looked down at Virginia with concerned eyes, and then looked back up at 2 moons. Yes, it does mention that, but how that happens and how she fights with us is different from how you and I will fight. It's different, Then that settles it, shouted 2 moons. If this really is Cohen, then we must not waste any more time talking. We must prepare for war. My people have been slaughtered, murdered, ravaged, and taken from their families for far too long. We have waited many years for Cohen to return to us. No more talk, no more waiting. Let us declare war. All the men stood up from their seats and gave a loud, thundering battle cry, drawing their weapons and holding them high in the air. Charles held out his hands, trying to calm the men down. Nathaniel and Tristan even attempted to silence the mob, but all the dignitaries, and even their own personal bodyguards, began to cheer louder and louder. All at once, everyone stopped shouting and looked down at the table, where they saw Andrew holding a wooden mallet in his hands, preparing to strike it again on the table. Seeing that all eyes were now upon him, he rested the hammer on the tabletop and motioned with his hand for everyone to sit down. All complied. The reason this council has survived all of these years without falling apart is that it has had strong men that led the people away from making foolish and irrational decisions, said Andrew. This, gentleman, is one of those moments, in case you were wondering. Seeing that her uncle's sanity was winning the attention of the mob, Virginia's breathing began to slow down. That was a close one. The reason that this council has been summoned, continued Andrew, is to discuss 2 main points, the possibility that Cohen has returned to us, and the procedures needed to protect her. He pointed his finger out to the east. Because, gentlemen, beyond those walls, our forces that have also seen the new star have taken it seriously and continue to do what it takes to kill any and all hope of that prophecy. He pointed his finger at Virginia. Her safety is our top priority at this juncture. Failure to perform that opens a door for darkness to make a better move. Daniel rose from his seat and spoke in a loud voice. With all that has been presented before you this evening at this council, does anyone feel that there is absolutely no chance that this young woman before us could possibly be Cohen? For the first time, Virginia begged in her heart for at least 2 moons to rise in defiance, yet even he remained silent along with everyone else at the table. She looked around to see if anyone would speak a word. Really? All of you? Very well, said Daniel. Does anyone have any objections to her remaining here in the city of Gaal until we decide what must be done next? The room remained just as silent as before. All right, said Daniel. As of now, this meeting is adjourned. Let us all eat. After all, we have a lot to celebrate, don't we, lads? All the men raised their glasses and gave a loud rejoicing cheer. Before Andrew and Daniel could completely sit down, the men at the table reached for the food. Some ripped off a whole leg from the roasted turkeys, others tore the wings, and the rest started to carve it crudely with either their silverware or their own weaponry. Some reached for the fruit bowl, accidentally knocking it over and spilling its produce across the table. The men stabbed the rolling pieces of fruit and laughed with delight at their capture as if it were a game. Wine and water were poured into their glasses by servants who elegantly, cautiously approached their way to the table, daring to get close to the wild and hungry men. The scene was all but a blur to Virginia. She looked around at all the men, but never gave a second thought to their ill-mannered behavior. A servant came from behind and poured wine and water into her 2 glasses to the right of her plate. However, she had never saw the liquid enter her cups. She looked down at her golden empty plate before her, seeing her reflection, and wondering who was staring back at her. Moments that seemed like hours passed by until the turkey leg was placed on her plate. She looked up and saw Charles pulling back the knife and fork in his hands. Didn't know if the leg was your favorite part or not, he said, but if you want something at this table, it's pretty much a brawling free-for-all. She stared at him with wondering, hopeless eyes and then back down at her plate. Is there something else that you want? He asked. Then he added jokingly, I'd be happy to fight to get it for you. Virginia looked back up at him and then back at her dish. With an emotionless, unresponsive face, she pushed the plate away from her and rose from her seat. She picked up her backpack and walked back towards the door Daniel had brought her through earlier. She pushed it open, sat down on the stone steps, and dropped her head to her knees, folding her arms around her face. Nothing seemed to be there. Nothing to cover her. Nothing to point her in the right direction. No one to show her the truth. Nothing to hold her up and support her. Everything was loose. Everything was falling apart underneath her. Alone in the stone stairway, with the faint sound of hungry men savagely feasting on their dinner in the other room, she sat in confusion, wonder, and doubt as she tried to put two and two together. She sat up straight and placed her face in her hands. Is all of this even for real? Is this just a very, very long dream? Nothing makes any sense. Just then, she heard the door open slowly. "Are you not hungry?" asked a voice. She looked up and saw Charles standing in the doorway. "Starving." "Well, then why don't you come back to the table and I'll get you something to—" "No!" She stood up on her feet. "I'm starving for the truth. I've been hunted, threatened, and experienced more near-death moments than I could care for in my whole life in the past few days, and all I want is a simple question answered. No matter how many times I ask, and no matter how simply I think it can be answered, no one, absolutely no one, has made it clear enough for me. Who am I? Why am I here?" Charles took a deep breath, not saying a word, but just waiting for her to speak. "Charles," she said, pointing herself over with her hands, "look at me. I'm not a warrior. I'm not a peacemaker. I do not know the first thing about fighting in a battle. These people tell me that I'm some great fulfillment of some ancient prophecy, but I hardly know the basics of this land. All I wanted was a normal life. Finish high school, get a job, start a family, live life, something simple. Is there something that can be said to convince them otherwise?" Charles took a few deep breaths before speaking. Then he pointed a thumb over his shoulder. "Out there is a force that desired to kill you so badly that they went beyond their own realm just to hunt you down. You may run for a while, but eventually, later in life, they'll find you again." Virginia sat back down on the stairs, looking at Charles as if someone suddenly pushed her out of a plane. "Then what can I do? What can I do to just live a normal life like everyone else?" "There's not an off switch to what is going on around you, Virginia," he said. "And there is no such thing as a normal life, only normal intentions." He knelt in front of her, looking at her at eye level. "But there is hope." "What hope? What can be done about all of this? What can I do?" "I believe I know something that might help, my dear," said a voice behind Charles. She looked up and saw Daniel holding a set of keys in his hands, and behind him stood Andrew. "Come with me," said Daniel. "There is something I must show you, and I believe now is the proper time." He looked down at Charles, and Soaring Eagle, you may come with us. Charles stood up, and Virginia with him. "If both of you could stand back, please," beckoned Daniel. Charles and Virginia took a few steps back up the staircase as Daniel and Andrew walked in, closing the door behind them. To the left of the door that Andrew had just closed was another oak door. Andrew grabbed one of the torches off the side of the wall. "Soaring Eagle, grab the other torch behind you. We are all going to need it." Charles complied and grabbed the torch on the wall next to him. Daniel placed a key into the door and turned it. Then, with a loud click, he finished its rotation and looked back at Charles and Virginia before opening it. "What you are about to see, where we are about to take you, is a place very few people are allowed to enter. What you see down here should not be spoken of when you return." Virginia stood closer to Charles, who held the torch before them. "What's down there?" Andrew passed Daniel the torch. "A test," said Daniel. "Something that will tell us once and for all if you are Cohen or not." She watched as Daniel placed his hand on the doorknob. "What's this place called?" she asked. Daniel pushed the door. As it creaked on its hinges, a gentle breeze escaped its chambers like a deep, chilling breath and splashed against their faces. Slowly it opened into a dark, haunting stairway that spiraled down below. "The secret chambers of Gaal," answered Daniel. He turned his back and walked down the stairs. The light of his torch was the only glow present. Andrew stepped down behind him. She felt Charles take her hand. "Are you ready?" asked Charles. Virginia looked up into his eyes, finding the small dose of strength she needed. She looked at the dark stairway as if it were a football player she was about to tackle. She wrapped her fingers around his hand. "Yes," she said, "I've been ready for a long time." They both walked into the dark, mysterious chambers, and as they did, Charles closed the door behind them.
This is the end of Chapter 23. Tune in next Thursday for Chapter 24. If you'd like to listen to the next chapter ad-free ahead of everyone else, then subscribe to Early Access and tune in on Sunday. If you like what you heard, please like and subscribe and share with your friends and family. It really helps the show. We're available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and all major podcasting platforms. What Shines with the Dawn was written and created by C. Taylor Eason. Copyright Christian Taylor Eason, 2024.